Hello, everyone. It's time for Chapter 15 Key Questions. So, we're getting right into it. Number one, what was the Second Great Awakening? The Second Great Awakening is a religious movement which happens between 1830 and 1840. This religious movement is a bit different from the first one because, unlike the first one, which was ended up being focused on the difference between the old lights and the new lights, the introduction of emotion into the preaching, and the challenging of authority, instead, the Second Great Awakening is more of a religious movement that begins with bringing people back to church, but ends up turning into a lot of social reforms. They looked past their doctrinal differences, their disagreements about how the Bible should be interpreted, and instead believed that churches should be working together to use their faith and use their belief to bring about changes in society. So, first, what religious groups emerged from the Second Great Awakening? Well, the Second Great Awakening brings about some groups are from the New York area. The New York area was called the Burned Over District, and that's where a lot of believers were convicted. But some of them were convicted in unconventional ways. And the most interesting faction that comes out of it is the Mormon group, founded by Joseph Smith, who believed that he had received golden tablets and interpreted them and created the Book of Mormon out of it. He leads a group that was viewed as heretical and blasphemous by other Christians. And so the Mormons who follow Joseph Smith end up migrating westward. After he's murdered, they then are led by Brigham Young out further west to escape pretty much all of civilization and society. And they settle in Utah, where they create their own kind of society, which will eventually join the United States in 1896. One thing that definitely set them apart was their practice and adoption of polygamy. Of course, that has since kind of gone away. Other groups include the Millerites or the Adventists, who believed that Jesus was coming in the 1840s, and then that would bring about kind of the end of the world. They were incorrect, by the way. So number three, what reforms came out of the Second Great Awakening? And this is the major focus of the Second Great Awakening. Those reform movements include abolition, temperance, women's rights, and prison and asylum reform. First, prison and asylum reform. Dorothea Dix travels the country studying exactly how prisoners and the mentally ill are being treated. And she spends her life cataloging that mistreatment and showing her journals and her notes to legislatures in hopes to get laws to pass to help them out. That's where we get the terms reformatories and penitentiaries from, and that they shifted from being a punishment and just kind of imprisonment into trying to reform and help out those prisoners who had committed crimes. Next, you have the temperance movement. Temperance is the idea that we need to control the intake of alcohol. It was created because, first of all, there's always going to be the idea of domestic abuse and bad husbands and family leaders who beat on their wives and children. But then you also have the industrial era who believes that this is hurting production, that this is hurting their ability to create the most effective means of production in their factories. The the leaders of the temperance movement might include Neil Dow, who helps pass the Maine Law of 1851, which bans alcohol. Next, we have abolition. Abolition has a lot of leaders throughout this time period. In class, I picked out specifically the Grimke sisters because they both represented women who were trying to attempt to establish women's rights, but also because they were two women from South Carolina who left behind a plantation lifestyle to preach against the circumstance in which they'd grown up. And they do a lot of good in that area. And finally, for women's rights, this is the launching of the official women's rights movement. In 1848, you have the Declaration of Sentiments, which is created at the Seneca Falls Convention, which was called by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Those two women had been neglected when they went to an abolitionist convention and were unable to speak because they were women. And so after they call Seneca Falls and write their Declaration of Sentiments, there is a growing movement throughout the next several decades, all the way until 1920, when women finally received the right to vote. That growing movement constantly pushes for women's equality, for them to be able to escape what we call the cult of domesticity at home, and for them to receive true equality in America. So those are the major reform movements that occur across our society because of the Second Great Awakening. Number four, describe the principles that led to the creation of the following groups. Each one of these four groups are interesting in their own right. The Shakers try to create an idealistic society founded by Mother Anne over in Europe, Her ideas come across the ocean. And while they were your typical religious group, which wanted to be the best they could be, following biblical principles, one thing that stood out about the Shakers was their celibacy. They believed that if they got rid of all sexuality, even amongst married couples, that they could limit the amount of sin and issues that people faced. New Harmony was a manufacturing society created by Robert Owen. Robert Owen wanted to try to create a society around manufacturing that treated everyone equally and paid everyone equally. Unfortunately for him, with the people who showed up at his society, it quickly collapsed as many criminals and other deplorables, if you will, caused his little society to collapse. The Oneida Community is probably the most strange out of these. The Oneida Community was founded by John Humphrey Noyes, and it was just kind of almost a cult in New York, which was founded on free love and complex marriage. We talked about some other specifics in class, which I'm sure you will have a hard time forgetting through the years. But the Oneida Community eventually loses its overall purpose after they kick out John Humphrey Noyes and just turns into a silverware manufacturer, which you can still purchase today. Brooks Farm was founded by transcendentalists. It was meant to be an escape for intellectuals where they could go and discuss their lofty ideas and just enjoy one another's company as they discuss those things. Collapses partially because of the lack of work ethic by some sources, but primarily because the money they invested in it all went away when their main hall that they were building and put all their funding into burnt down. So that brings me to number 5. What brought about the temperance movement of the early 1800s? I've already touched on it, but primarily just the Second Great Awakening wanted to limit the sins that people faced and committed. And so that moral commitment by church groups fed into the idea that maybe we could get rid of many of these sins if we got rid of alcohol. And then finally, manufacturing and the growth of the market economy impacted the temperance movement as well, as it wanted people to limit their alcohol intake so they could be more productive and successful workers. Number 6, what was the Transcendentalist movement? Transcendentalists believed that inside of yourself was pretty much all of the knowledge that you needed. That knowledge came from within, not from the senses. One could consider this a movement against the Enlightenment, which tried to get rid of all emotion, instead choose everything by science and logic and observation. What it was is this fits in really well with the Jacksonian movement of the individual, the common man, all being equally and all having a say. This movement is pushed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson travels around the country in his Lyceum circuits, giving speeches on the American scholar and fierce individualism, the belief that we can achieve whatever we need to through our own decisions. Its other primary member was Henry David Thoreau, an outspoken critic of nearly everything he faced. He lived for a year in the woods in his book Walden. And then finally, the major thing he's remembered for is on civil disobedience. As the Mexican-American War breaks out, he refuses to pay his taxes as he knew that money would go to support a war which he did not. And so Henry David Thoreau influences future generations of protesters like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi in saying that we should be allowed to civilly protest and disobey our laws. So this does it for Chapter 15. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to shoot me an email or ask me in class. Until then, have a wonderful day.